Hi, chapter 5 and chapter 6. So hopefully I'll keep this pretty short. Chapter 5 has a key word in it. I believe it's the word fragmentation. And fragmentation, of course, refers to ruptures and a continuity. And the author is referring to these pieces that are um, they're they're all over the place, and somebody or somebody's need to put it all together to try to make sense of this historical process that then an identity would need to be constructed out of what was before. And so he focuses on the beginnings of the construction of what we consider today in modern parlance the Mexican identity. And of course, there's these factors in social pressures that are feeding uh, this attempt at consolidating an identity, consolidating a Mexican national identity, and they're competing. The old, the old, I'm referring to the conservative aspect of the ones have been controlling Mexico or Nueva España at the time, is to kind of keep things the same way. That way, their power hold doesn't get challenged, which is based on the wealth being produced by the slave labor force, primarily made up of natives and to a lesser extent Africans. The liberals are challenging that, and but there's aspects in the liberal wing that want to rush that process, and there's the conservative part of the liberal wing that wants to integrate gradually and to see how what the outcomes are. All and the people that are handling this are people who hold prejudices, hold racist aspects, which is a system that they themselves implemented, and what we call the casta system. So here we are, racist people trying to integrate people they themselves uh, hate because they are of a inferior quality from their um, assumption. So we see that in chapter 5 how this fragmentation not only in the historical aspect of in the case for the Mexican territory, but this back and forth and not and no one having the upper hand or having it for a brief period of time causes that the government, the Mexican government, cannot consolidate completely after it frees itself from Spain. Now, Spain itself wants Mexico back, but because Spain has spent most of the wealth throwing themselves a party for 200 years, yeah, practically almost 300 years actually. They no longer have the resources and can no longer have, they don't have credit to be able to borrow to be able to try to invade Mexico, and so they could no longer afford it. So it gave Mexicans a chance to consolidate. But of course, you have all these interested parties who came together to throw the Spanish out. But now they're looking at each other like, who's going to be the king? Who's going to be the middle? And of course, whoever tries to gets challenged by others, and of course leads to conflict. And so you have all these separate little fiefdoms of criollos, the criollos because they displaced the Guachupines, trying to fight and vie for power. And that would make, over a long period of time, a couple of decades, vulnerable to nations like the United States and France, who are hungry for land and slaves, because ultimately the way the systems are being set up is slave. It's a slave owning system. Now, not slave in the traditional sense, like I own this human being, but as in cheap labor, exploit, squeeze the cheap labor to create wealth. All right, so I'm gonna say that much about chapter 5. In chapter 6, we see the focus is primarily in the northern territories, because and the reason the author's starting to do that for us is because he's going to start moving the book towards the Chicano experience, the creation of the Chicano identity, right? And it's this group of people who have been rejected by two populations. One population, the Cachupinas Criollos, and the other population, the native Repúblicas de Indios and native nations that are now under the control of the Criollos and the Cachupinas. So this group is growing gradually, but they don't fit in very well anywhere. So they're used by both groups, and of course these people learn to react and look out for number one, look out for your immediate needs, and so they'll cooperate primarily with the Criollos and the Cachuminas for a while, and eventually would adopt the outlook and would become the very oppressors of the native people when the Criollos would begin to also to extent lose some power. I mean, there's still pockets in modern Mexico where you still see the Criollo culture, but the nation itself, in creating a national identity, began to undermine the Criollo. Those who like always vie for Spain and their Spanish heritage, and instead begin to create a narrative that began to give credit more to the mestizo, and the mestizo, because of being squeezed between two groups, they began to participate and eventually, rightfully so, take some credit for some of the accomplishments to make Mexico a free autonomous nation to the extent of the word, even though that could be put into question too, the autonomy part of it. At least politically, they might be autonomous, but economically, they're pretty much tied, especially to the United States right now. Anyways, moving on. Here in the Northern Territories, Chapter 6, there's an attempt at replicating these hacienda-like processes. The Catholic Church takes a nice active role in doing the very similar thing. They might not carry the caudillo title in this case, but they're definitely using the same model, enslaving the natives, making them produce, and creating these mission-like mini territories with land holdings, which made the Catholic Church very rich, very rich. And to this day, the Catholic Church still retains a degree of wealth and powerful economic hold in some respects. Not so much in California, of course. In several places, it's waned quite a bit. Let's move on. So we're seeing here that once again the native people and the mestizo people are being used as a form of cheap labor to be able to create these colonies across the northern territories. California, Nuevo Mexico, and Texas is where he focuses primarily in. And of course, then we begin to see the insertion here of the Anglo-American. The Anglo-American first shows up. He's not a real threat because they're just traders, people that trade goods and services out of the East Coast. And they're taken in by the criollos and the ones who might be able to get away with criollo title because they might look a little more European. And those Anglos begin to intermarry with some of these criollo Mexican types. And begin to, of course, the interest is, I'm going to marry into a family with a large holding, and eventually I will take control of that and of course, inherit it. And so you see this pattern replicated across, particularly in California, and to an extent in Nuevo Mexico. Texas is a little bit different. Texas is there's a similar process in the context of haciendas and ranchos, but again, it's the land itself doesn't lend itself to easy exploitation of it. Hence, the populations remain lightly for the westernized types, for the ones who go out and develop cash crops. I'm not talking about the large contingent of native people that live in those areas who have not been domesticated and integrated into the economic system. Okay, so when we talk about when Mexico talks about their lightly populated northern territories, they're talking about people. They're talking about themselves who've been westernized and colonized, and who have bought into the new economic system. We're not talking about all the native people who live in those territories, the Apaches, the Hopis, the Dene Navajo, which are just some of the main groups. But there's like the Yaquis. There's just hundreds of them, and they number in the thousands. Okay, so so the Anglo comes in, and a new dynamic is coming into play, right? Because he's going to move on to the Anglo-American takeover of the territory. So the Anglo's already coming in. He's marrying into the new Mexican culture that's being created through the doorway in is through marriage, and taking that over and taking over the lands. And of course, when the Anglos show up, they have already allies in place, people who are going to play ball with them because they're being intermarried there. I don't recall a particular famous Anglo who took the Mexican side in defending the California and New Mexico territories. There might have been. I just haven't dug that far in. Another thing the author finishes with is how this racism is being spread through the Mexican westernized angle, right? Of looking at native people and always looking down at them and seeing them only as a source of cheap labor to be able to exploit. And he quotes a I don't know if it's a Franciscus friar, but one of the people who's part of the mission, those missions. There's tours of these missions today where of course, they always talk about how wonderful they were and how they converted the natives. They have this just fluff story about what happened there, when in reality they were just not. They were pretty cruel and made the native population very vulnerable. All right, so we'll leave it at that because I'm already past 10 minutes, and talk to you next Tuesday. Bye bye.